what they've done with this is you have the mass layer that's out there through the traditional propaganda publications, but also, in terms of reach, things like Xiaohongshu, TikTok, obviously internally Douyin, reaching out online, reaching out on Telegram, right? Like they've gotten the reach to the mass audience, and they focused a lot on those pipelines, right? So how do we make sure that people get it? How do we get, phones that are loaded with things out into Africa, into Latin America, and elsewhere? We have to be honest.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of successful democratic pushback, right, at the kinds of influence operations, the kinds of interference that we are seeing at the scale that Beijing is operating, right? This is, we did maybe some things at the beginning of the Cold War that were effective against the Soviet threat in Europe and the United States, but then we lost some of those things. So we have to be kind of clear that, like, in this modern age, where some of these traditional forms of political action have been amped up by technology, that we don't have good cases of what is really successful.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Freedom is Not Free and 新闻硬邦邦 channels. Today I have an honor to visit Jamestown Foundation and talk to the president of the Jamestown Foundation, Peter Mattis, one of the most respected analysts on Chinese intelligence, influence operations, and elite politics. We will talk about Taiwan, we'll talk about Indo-Pacific region, we'll talk about China and Chinese expansionism today. Thank you so much, Peter, for agreeing to take part in my show.
No, thank you for coming to visit us in DC. It's nice to see you, here in our offices rather than out in some, part of Brussels or elsewhere in the world. So, welcome back to the US.
And thank you so much for your support of Taiwan and of democracy and freedom everywhere in the world. Could you, because not every Taiwanese person most of my viewers are Taiwanese, they don't know much about Jamestown Foundation as an organization and like the whole think tank culture here in DC. Could you tell a little bit about Jamestown and what is your main goal?
Look, the main goal of the Jamestown Foundation from its very beginning in 1983 to the present day is about helping Americans and our partners understand our adversaries, and in some cases our allies, in their own words and in their own terms. Right? Everything that Jamestown does is grounded in local experience and expertise and sourcing. So you're not going to find a bunch of articles on Jamestown's website saying, this is, what the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times have to say about this, right? If we're writing about Taiwan, we're going to use Taiwanese news media and we will talk to Taiwanese officials. If we're writing about what the PLA is doing, we're using whether it's the propaganda films, whether it's the PLA Daily, whether it's some of the magazines and newspapers that come out from the system, right? Everything that we do is like that. And that's whether it is on China and Taiwan, whether it's on terrorism, or whether it's on Russia and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus. And as a result, like Jamestown is kind of a light DC office. We're relatively small. And we have a network of well over 120 analysts that's probably in 50 or 60 countries worldwide of contributors. But the important thing, and this is important especially for Taiwanese, is that publications like China Brief, Eurasia Daily Monitor are open to people to contribute and to submit pieces to. So if you have something to say that's analytic, that's grounded in sourcing, grounded in sort of facts and analysis, not about what you want to do out in the world, but how the world is, right? We're an open place for publication. And really some of our best authors right now, I think, are from Taiwan, writing some really good stuff about the PLA, like Tristan Tall.
Wow. Yeah, because Taiwan has first-hand experience and actually is on the front line of standing up to autocracies like the PRC. And because many people in the United States, in Europe, are talking about the evolution of authoritarian propaganda, of influence operations. From your perspective, how has the Chinese Communist Party's approach to propaganda and influence operations against the US and other democratic allies evolved over past decades? And what do you see as its vulnerabilities?
I think the biggest evolution, if you will, is the professionalization of their propaganda system. It's not that it wasn't a professional system before, but if you start thinking about, because you are a communications professional, right? When you start thinking about how do you reach an audience, And how do you build things out, right? You have kind of a pyramid of like, okay, well, we've got to get this base layer of a kind of content. Then we have to have this other layer of how we, get shorter clips in this way. And how do we cross-post things, integrate them across, a platform. And then you keep going like, oh, who can we get as individuals to promote, the work and what it is, right? And they've sort of formalized this, I think, in ways that are quite scary when you start thinking about all of it being put together, right? They already knew how propaganda works. They already knew how to plant ideas. They already had influence operations, if you will, as kind of a normal thing, right? In democratic countries, these are actually sort of covert actions. They require specific sign-off. We kind of think of them as like a play in a football game, so to speak, right? It's, okay, we're going to do this to do this. Whereas for the Ministry of State Security, for the Propaganda Department, for even the Ministry of Public Security, for the People's Liberation Army, right? It's just another day that ends in Y. But what they've done with this is you have the mass layer that's out there through the traditional propaganda publications, but also, in terms of reach, things like Xiaohongshu, TikTok, obviously internally Douyin, reaching out online, reaching out on Telegram, right? Like they've gotten the reach to the mass audience, and they focused a lot on those pipelines, right? So how do we make sure that people get it? How do we get, phones that are loaded with things out into Africa, into Latin America, and elsewhere, right? And then I think you can see the signs. I think the Taiwanese have been the most effective at exposing this, right? But the efforts to recruit individuals that have no connection to China, have no direct sort of relationship with the party, to now be like, oh, actually, in addition to what you come here for about health issues or exercise or diet or whatever, did you know that the CCP is pushing these really good things inside China, and trying to frame their story in this way. When you start hearing people say, like in an American context, saying, well, the CCP is socially conservative. Yeah, but who cares, right? That's so far down the list of how conservatives should view a communist party.
Yeah.
Right.
Are they socially conservative? That's also another question, because if you look at the countries like Russia, like China, and you look at all of the like abortion rates, for example, how is it socially conservative when a country actually promotes abortion and have the whole like one China policy, or the HIV rates? Like I know about Russian statistics, like the level is it's on the level with like many African countries. How can a socially conservative country have these societal problems? And social conservatives meaning also adhering to religious faith, and China is one of the most anti-religious countries. And still, do you think that people believe that they're socially conservative?
I think it's a story that they try to tell, but not as effectively as some of the other countries that are problems out in the world. But I think it gets to this issue of like, well, this is why the local experience matters and local source, right? Because it's not what they say, it's what actually happens inside the country, right? Certainly the case in Russia, they try to tell a nice story, but then all of these things are taking place. If you are looking at the PRC, right, they're telling a nice story, but right, fundamental to conservative values is the issue of property rights. Those don't exist, right? I at least got raised with the idea that government doesn't belong in the bedroom, doesn't belong in your home. And the CCP very sort of soundly says, no, actually, we belong in it. And you look at the kinds of things that they're checking, just for the monitoring and surveillance system in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, right? They're checking electricity usage and water usage, basically to be like, do you have guests? How long do you have guests? Well, if they've stayed past a certain time, then there's obviously a problem. What are you doing? You must be organizing a terrorist cell.
Or how many times did you go to the mosque?
Yeah.
Why did you go there?
Right. And like those are the things that we should be paying attention to. And I think that's what this idea of Jamestown does well, of no, let's look at what they're doing, right? Not just what they're saying, that's important too, but look at how it's going in practice. How is it being implemented? What are they doing? Because it's a system that actually has to operate in the open in ways that most people don't think a communist party would have to operate.
And the next question would be, they do blur the lines between economic coercion, between social media propaganda, between lifestyle content, between political pressure. It's like, as they say, it's a united front, and they utilize any means that they have. But what can be done about these efforts?
The first thing I think is to recognize what it is, right? You know, for example, like if we're talking about a military attack on Taiwan, right, we're like, oh, well, what's the military strategy? What's this approach? Like, no. The issue with Taiwan is a political outcome. Beijing wants Taiwan to be a part of the People's Republic of China, subject to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, right? That's a political program, right? And therefore, there's a military component to it, there's an economic component to it, there's an influence operations component to it, there's an intelligence component to it. So I think we have to start understanding these things as being oriented toward a political objective, right? Because politics, I mean, just look at what Xi Jinping says. Look at what Hu Jintao said before him, Jiang Zemin, and all the way back, right? Politics is at the forefront of everything the party does.
Yes.
It politicizes everything, right? You can't even, you know, you look at children's cartoons and how they become associated with memes or other images and like, oh, that's got to go, right? There's a song by Fish Liang, I think it's by the English name, you know, that just got banned in the PRC or shut down because, you know, maybe it was linked to how Chinese people feel about Xi Jinping after Maduro was gone, right? We have to see that politics as being the forefront of it. And so I think it means that we have to start looking at these problems, not just to say, like, you know, to use intelligence as an example, like this isn't an espionage case. It's not about a loss of information. It's what are the political effects of these things that are being done, right? What does an espionage case do? It breaks down trust inside an office. It breaks down trust between Taiwan and its partners. Therefore, we need to see it as this kind of political campaign pushing in this direction. Once you see that, I think it puts us in the right frame of mind where we can say, you know, for all the gray zone activities or like all of the little incursions that are taking place, right? Most of the time in the West, in Taiwan, in many other countries, they sort of say, well, this doesn't rise to a military response. This doesn't rise to a diplomatic response, or maybe this rises to, you know, this response in an international organization, right? But what we miss is that our people, whether they're Americans, Taiwanese, Poles, Germans, is that they're experiencing the full brunt of what that was. And we're not responding in kind, right? And they sit here, and yes, we may have a perfectly rational decision in the military, a perfectly rational decision in an economic bureau or a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, saying, we don't need to respond to this. But the target has experienced all of it. And I think once you understand that component, it now encourages, you know, frankly, a greater willingness to act. I think it's less actually of someone like me or someone else saying, do this, do this, do this, do this. It's recognizing that as long as there are no consequences, there are no risks that are being taken, right? And yet you can see it everywhere. We say, oh, Beijing's doing risky behavior. Is it really a risk if they didn't face a consequence? So we have to be prepared to say, okay, what consequences can we impose? The second thing is that democracies try to see things in proportional or just sorts of terms. But are we going to take hostages? Are we going to do the things that Beijing does, you know, to hold people on an exit ban just because? Are we going to put pressure on family members and say, well, maybe they don't get medical care because, you know, you're being bad? Like, we're not going to do those things. And I think we have to get to the idea that our responses are going to be asymmetric or disproportional, and understand that that's okay. But our people need to see us responding. And that gets to a third point of we've got to start being a lot more open about what the party's objectives are, because they're clear on it. And we have to be more clear about what we're doing, right? There are lots of things that you can find out if you're in Taiwan and you see, and you just talk to people and you go around, but they're not necessarily publicly known. Same thing in the United States. And we're a democracy. You can't have people respond and respect the government and see what needs to be done, or to use their agency as citizens to say, you know what, this is my sphere of influence. This is what I can affect in my neighborhood or my school or my company or my media environment. right? And we all operate in different sorts of places, but we're all citizens, right? And if our government's not saying, this is what we're facing, these are the challenges, remember to step up, how do you actually have the strength of a democracy, which is its citizens stepping in to say, oh, let's fix that, or let's address this, or why are we using, this app to disseminate school stuff? Why don't we do this instead? Or whatever those little things are, right? So that's kind of how I see it. It's like you have to face the facts. You have to see what it is. You have to see that our responses are going to be disproportionate. They're going to be asymmetric. There is no proportional response to fundamentally unjust and inhumane actions, right? And then we need to be talking about it more so that we have awareness and a sense of purpose, and our citizenry can actually take action to protect themselves, their families, their corporations, their social sphere.
Do you think that the government should do more in explaining the policies that target the propaganda issues, that target the personal data issues? Because when there was a discussion here in the United States about TikTok and the possible TikTok ban, or when Taiwan banned Xiaohongshu for the fraud issues, you still see some societal resistance to that because some of the freedoms are being limited and you are losing access to some of those apps. What do you think should be done to explain to the citizens that sometimes some measures have to be actually done to not to fight that, but to protect you from those malicious behaviors from the adversary states?
It's one of those things that's being talked about in some circles, but not as widely as it needs to be understood, is the issue of values and technology and how they fit together, right? It's not that democratic countries don't have surveillance technologies, right? But the way in which we would train people in their usage is fundamentally different, and sort of a different set of skills and a different way of operating than if you are looking at the Haiku and other sort of devices that are shipped out from the PRC to the world. And right, these things, Hikvision, right, like these are just not, the corporations, the services, they actually aren't in tune with our values. And I think this is one of those things that we've kind of forgotten. And Karl Popper, the philosopher, talked a bit about this, of like, a tolerant society actually has to be intolerant of intolerance. Right? Basically, if a value system or a set of actions is antithetical to this open society, the open society actually has to say, no, we're not open to this. This is unacceptable. And I think that that's what we actually need to recognize on the CCP side, right? Do they share our values, right? They've said that actually free speech is a national security issue. They've said a free press is a national security issue, right? That fundamentally undermined the party state's sense of security, right? They define security by the relative absence of threats to the party's ability to govern, right? So there's so many things that go into this. They require a certain amount of control and a certain amount of insight into those systems, right? So that, I think we need to kind of recognize that if we're dealing with this intolerant system and it is sort of pushing things into our system for us to consume, to be able to sort of shift mass opinion, right? Because that's what a social media app does ultimately, and it can be manipulated. We know that, and we know that it can manipulate moods on a mass scale. If you're waiting for the smoking gun, right, that means there's a body on the floor, right? And why should we be giving an intolerant system one that we know is intolerant, one that we know seeks to manipulate and has a political purpose that's antithetical to the continuing function of a democracy? Why do we pretend that they're innocent until proven guilty, right? We already have lots of bodies on the floor. You brought up economic coercion, right? The efforts to bring down companies, to steal their technology, to bankrupt them, then acquire them, right? The efforts to secure talent and bring them back, the efforts on a mass scale for industrial and economic espionage, right? These are all things that we know, right? So why are we now pretending like every new thing is going to be something that we have to treat as a new thing?
They have a very bad record, and if you have criminal record in the U.S., you have consequences. But why, if you have very bad record internationally, there are no consequences?
Right, and so I think that's the piece where, you can hear an argument of like, well, we don't have cultural competence if we're banning these kinds of things. But really it comes down to the fact that if these are systems, if these are part of our public commons, why would we want control over a public space be given to a party that says there is no public space, there's only our spaces, right? We're citizens, we're not subjects.
This is very interesting because even if you look at the Chinese ID cards, 身份证, they don't use the word citizen there. They use the word resident. It's only that they only reside in China. And in the constitution, there is a word citizen. So it's a very, Chinese people laugh about it like many times. You have been to Taiwan many times, and you know that Taiwan is being on the front line in the information war, fighting back against the communist propaganda, the different coercion reports. And you just gave some examples with some people, some influencers doing their content, but then all of a sudden saying, oh, do you know that China is so advanced and they have so beautiful cities, it looks like cyberpunk, and people are very friendly, good food, and whatever, like cultural tourist thingy. Where do you think, in terms of media literacy and civil society, government coordination, do you think where Taiwan performs the best in terms of targeting those coercion efforts, and where Taiwan lacks and should start doing something more?
It's a hard question because one of the things, again, I think this gets to this point of like, we have to be honest.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of successful democratic pushback,
Okay.
right? At the kinds of influence operations, the kinds of interference that we're seeing at the scale that Beijing is operating, right? This is, we did maybe some things at the beginning of the Cold War that were effective against the Soviet threat in Europe, in the United States, but then we lost some of those things. So we have to be kind of clear that like in this modern age where some of these traditional forms of political action have been amped up by technology, that we don't have good cases of what is really successful. Right? People have liked to say, oh, well, transparency is the best disinfectant. Sunshine will kind of clean things out, right? And there's an element of that, transparency is active and you have to build it. But you know what? We've also seen a lot of cases where, yeah, we have transparency. We've brought things to the forefront, but there wasn't a criminal prosecution. There wasn't a financial penalty. There wasn't, some other direct personal consequences. People didn't lose jobs. And so I think that's one of those areas where we have to be honest that, yeah, we brought transparency in some cases, but then it didn't have an effect because it wasn't married with political power. And I think there are a couple of things that Taiwan is doing well. The first was that President Lai Ching-te gave a good speech outlining the subversive threat. Yeah. Just about a year ago in March, outlining the 17 measures. Right, and we can debate whether or not the 17 measures are the right thing. However, it was a president saying, this is what we're facing. These are the kinds of things that we have to be prepared to do and where we have to be prepared to draw lines, right? Because we're in a democratic system and we want government efforts to be focused on the legal activity, not governing what citizens do in a legal space. So that, I think, was a really critical thing of the president saying leadership and giving out some of these sort of policy directives to the Mainland Affairs Council and other places. Yeah. And that, I think, is an important component, but he also has to keep it up, right? There's a narrative in Taiwan, so this gets to a second point of like, you have to contest some of the narratives. And this is something where, I think Taiwanese civil society has been better than others at organizing little groups, whether it's individuals or formal NGOs that are pushing back, that are identifying it, doing fact-checking. Yeah. It's very strong. It's not covering everything, because it can't, but it's better than everywhere else, in a sense. That you're contesting the narratives, and it's coming from that level, it's also coming from above, because specifically one thing that I've seen appear in the last couple of months is this like, well, is it really an espionage issue? So-called spies, so-called collaborators, right? And even in the context of Taiwan and the history of the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, like, why did the Kuomintang lose the revolution? Because so much of their decision-making was corrupted by the CCP from the very beginning. Back in the 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff was a CCP spy. The personal private secretary for the head of KMT intelligence was a CCP spy, right? And it goes on and on and on, where you see people in key positions in the KMT at kind of the nodes of information and movement were CCP spies. Like, this is what they do, right? United Front is in a sense the political side of espionage. It's a form of political warfare. How do we bring people into the party and guide them in the direction that we want? How do we identify our friends and mobilize them to strike at our enemies, right? And these aren't so-called collaborators, right? Maybe some people were guilty and were convicted. Maybe some people were guilty but not convicted, right? That happens. Maybe some people were wrongly accused and were innocent. But like, it's pretty hard to argue that that isn't real. And I think that that's an element of where, you know, it's a government and a civil society thing. Where they've done well and where they need to push back is start dealing now with that next level of, no, these things are real. There is this issue with TikTok. There is this issue, not, you know, and don't dress it up as fraud, right? Back in the 1930s, we arrested Al Capone, a gangster in Chicago, on federal tax evasion charges. He hadn't paid his income tax. You know, the reason why that worked as a tool is because everyone knew what Al Capone was being arrested for, that it was for murder, for racketeering, for smuggling, and bootlegging, right? Everyone knew what it was. But you can't Al Capone these other cases when our societies are not prepared and not thinking about these things.
And not as aware about these activities that the Communist Party of China conducts. Peter, how do you assess the U.S. institutional awareness of unrestricted warfare on the United Front activities? Would it be in the U.S. or internationally? Do you think that the U.S. is prepared and the U.S. understands what is going on?
I think there's such a huge variation, right? It's a hugely individual kind of effort, right? Because let's take if you take a look at, say, the academic literature on the party's relationship with business, you know, there are roughly 10 books in the last 20 years on this issue. You know, reputable academic presses. None of them mention United Front in any serious way. Mm-hmm. Yet if you look at all of the ways, all of the business associations, all of the ways in which businesses and capital are controlled, right, it all runs through the United Front system, right? Or it involves a United Front approach from senior officials sort of applying it in their domain. But it's not mentioned at all. You know, maybe an organ or a body is mentioned in some cases, right? But when have you heard the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and all of its provincial and local versions described as anything other than like, oh, this is a little advisory body, right? Oh, you know, they have this cute little 2 sessions meeting, you know, coming up in about, you know, coming up in, 6-7 weeks. But that's kind of all we refer to it. So we're not, you know, in a sense, we're not getting people through an academic pipeline that naturally have a real awareness of this side of the party, right? And they don't necessarily come out of schools, which would be a much more normal thing, with an understanding of the party's underground movement, how they operated in the urban centers, because they were essentially, you know, whether you want to call them a terrorist organization or intelligence organization or security organization, you know, the underground elements of it very much were those things. And we don't have a lot of awareness. So if you have knowledgeable officials, regardless where they are, whether they're in government or whether the former is now outside, it's a hugely individualized effort, right? And there's no clear kind of institutional pipeline that's bringing people along and making sure that that expertise is available, right? And that's where, you know, the United States ends up being better off than most because we have a robust China studies community. It has always been a significant part of government. You know, even in the sort of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was the focus and the two countries had split, there was still a substantial China effort, right? And it was kind of institutionally strong enough to have its own organizational culture to say, here's how we handle China issues, here's how we look at these things. And that's kind of there, but it's not enough, right? Because this isn't a natural way of understanding the party or a natural way of looking at them. And so, you know, again, it ends up being kind of an uneven stepstone. It's just the US is better off because we have more people in a larger system to kind of have more chances at getting the right expertise.
Because right now you see some coordination efforts between autocracies, like Russia and China have media cooperation agreements, for example. Russia never reports badly on China, and China never reports badly on Russia, because they started this cooperation in 2008, 2009, many years ago. Do you think that there is a need for more coordination between the democracies in terms of pushing back against the media narratives that come from authoritarian countries?
Well, I think the obvious answer to that is yes. The question is, well, what's the mechanism? How do you do these things? You know, some of the proudest stuff that I've been a part of here at Jamestown since coming back is that we have worked with a lot of media organizations in terms of, you know, how do you do United Front reporting, you know, and helping sort of vet the research and pull things together. And I think that more of that kind of thing needs to take place, more of these collaborative efforts, because at the end of the day, our China coverage in a lot of countries just is not that great. And unfortunately, I mean, I hate to say it, I'm a little disappointed with where Taiwan's China coverage is these days. And, you know, people can give different reasons for that. I think the vice minister of the NSB about 7-8 years ago had said, well, actually, there's a significant part of the Taiwanese media landscape that's walking the same road as the CCP. But it does mean, okay, how do we do our facts analysis? How do we organize things? How do we make sure that journalists have the right experience and exposure? Because Beijing has forced us into a position where we have to study China from offshore again.
Yeah.
Right? But we no longer have the benefit of the University Services Center in Hong Kong. We no longer have the benefit of sort of a natural escape hatch for people to come out and help. You know, this is actually what Jamestown did back in the 1980s, was helping defectors kind of write their memoirs, tell their stories, help explain to Americans, you know, what are the stakes of everyday life behind the Iron Curtain? How do you understand what their governments are actually about, rather than the nice words that they say about how they support peace and international development, right? So I don't think we've quite adjusted to this idea that it's no longer access to the PRC that is going to define how journalism works, how academia works, how we can build expertise. And that's something that we're going to have to adjust to in some pretty substantial ways, because if we're only writing stories where we have reporters that can go to the scene and look at it, then we're not really going to get anything resembling a complete picture.
So there's still a need for comprehensive analysis, and we need more experts on that region.
Well, just also more people with more experience.
Yeah.
Right? How many European newspapers, for example, have more than one China correspondent? You know, or more than one or two, right? It's not all that substantial. And chances are, if those correspondents are any good, they're not going to get their visa renewed. Yeah. Right? Or it's going to be a huge extractive process for the newspaper to be like, no, we're sorry, we won't do those kinds of things, or we'll be careful, right? But, you know, we know the pressure has been put on media organizations about individual reporters and individual stories in ways that, you know, if you're in a democratic system, it's kind of like, you know, don't be bad, don't piss us off, like, don't make us angry, or else, you know, we'll call you in again and tell you how angry we are, right? But that's not how Beijing operates, right? It's like, if you make us angry, you're never working here again.
Yeah. You will have consequences. Unlike the PRC officials anywhere in the world, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Peter. And the final question would be, do you have any recommendations to the general public how to spot the propaganda, how to spot the narrative that comes from, that has some beneficiaries outside of the democratic world?
Unfortunately, I think the easiest way to identify things is to have some awareness of what these systems are about. You know, so it means that you're going to have to spend a little bit of time with kind of propaganda at the peak level, which is not, you know, it's like a trip to the dentist. Or actually, as one of the old China hands said, you know, going through party documents is like chewing sawdust.
It's very miserable.
But, you know, if you want to understand what Putin means by root causes, you know, what he means by, what he refers to as an ancient Rus because he can't bring himself to call it the Kievan Rus.
Yeah.
Right? You got to go read some of his speeches because those are going to outline the themes.
Yeah.
Right? One of the things that we don't understand as a system that does sort of propaganda and influence as a set piece, as an approved operation, is that the guidance for what propagandists are supposed to do is out there in the open. It has to be out there in the open from a Putin or from a Xi Jinping, because that's what's setting the lines of here are our objectives, here are the themes, here's what you need to push, and I'm leaving it in your hands because you're the expert with the tools and the craft to deliver those points and to move us in that direction. So if you spend a little bit of time, read a couple of Xi Jinping speeches, read a couple of Putin speeches, like that's probably your first thing that'll give you a little bit of awareness of, okay, what are the narratives and how do they think? And then you obviously want to read a little bit about how a Beijing or Moscow views your country, right? Because Moscow's propaganda about, say, Estonia is going to be very different than what it is towards Poland versus what it is towards Germany and then what it is towards the United States, right? And similarly for the CCP, that view of what is Taiwan? What is Japan?
What is Vietnam?
What is Vietnam?
What is India?
Well, and maybe the Ryukyu Islands were actually ours and should be returned.
That's what they're actually pushing right
Yep.
now. You see it on the internet and in the news, like Liu Xing, like one of their TV stars. Let's start discussing the Okinawa status again. What?
Right, but that's when you get a sense of what those objectives are, when you look at how they describe the world, and then you read a little bit about how they're describing your own country. That's really your roadmap for what are going to be those narratives, and how do you understand what those things are, and how to pay attention to it, right? And in some ways, it's kind of like going back to a high school class, high school literature class where you're analyzing what things mean, because it's the same. It's kind of the same skill set. It's not actually more complicated. It's not a new thing that we have to learn. It's arguably harder for those of older generations that were used to a more standard sort of media set, not as diverse, not as disparate, not as sort of cacophonous as was, right? Because they were trained on a media environment that was very different. I think younger people are a little more prepared for it, but they don't necessarily have, right? They might have the sort of the mental toolkit and the critical thinking skills, but they're not necessarily getting the roadmap of, okay, here's what you need to be watching for. And when you bring those two things together, then it actually puts us in a relatively good place.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for watching. If you are interested in Jamestown Foundation activities, there is the link to their website, and you're always welcome to submit articles, submit your analysis to Jamestown.
And sign up for either the Substack or the mailing list, because our primary publications, Terrorism Monitor, China Brief, Eurasia Daily Monitor, are all free on the website, and they're all free to subscribe to. So, be it.
Thank you. Thank you.